Lee Seung-seop, StarCraft. On August 3rd, 2005, 28-year-old Lee Seung-seop walked into an internet cafe in the city of Daegu, South Korea, sat down at a terminal, and loaded StarCraft. He had lost his job several weeks earlier for habitual lateness, a consequence of gaming sessions that had already been extending through the nights and into his work mornings. 6 weeks before this visit, his girlfriend had ended their relationship, reportedly citing the same habit. By the time he settled into his seat that Wednesday afternoon, Lee had almost nothing left outside the game. What followed was nearly 50 hours of continuous play. Witnesses at the cafe recalled him taking only short bathroom breaks, barely eating, and sleeping briefly at the keyboard before reloading another match. The cafe staff knew him as a regular. None of them intervened. On the morning of August 5th, Lee collapsed at his terminal. Paramedics were called, but he was unresponsive. He was pronounced dead at a nearby hospital. Doctors concluded the cause was cardiac arrest, brought on by severe exhaustion, dehydration, and the effects of prolonged immobility on circulation conditions, compounded by the fact that he had not consumed adequate food or water over the 2 days prior. Lee's death was covered by news outlets across South Korea and quickly spread internationally, arriving at a moment when the country was already wrestling publicly with the concept of internet and gaming addiction. South Korea had opened dedicated clinics to treat compulsive online gaming. By 2002, had established legal limits on cafe operating hours and had begun screening teenagers for gaming disorder in school health programs. The response to Lee's death accelerated that conversation sharply. The Korean government strengthened regulations around internet cafe safety monitoring shortly afterward, and Lee's case became one of the most cited examples in subsequent global discussions about gaming addiction. He was 28 years old. His StarCraft account was still logged in when he died, the current match he had been playing still running on the screen above him. The international coverage generated by his case reached gaming communities across Europe and the United States at a time when internet cafe culture was still expanding globally and contributed to early discussions about whether gaming platforms and cafe operators had any duty of care toward customers exhibiting visible signs of distress or physical deterioration. Those conversations produced few concrete regulatory outcomes outside South Korea in the immediate years following his death, but Lee's case remained the reference point most frequently cited when gaming addiction entered mainstream public health debate in the following decade. Chen Rong-yu, League of Legends. On February 1st, 2012, 23-year-old Chen Rong-yu checked into an internet cafe in New Taipei City, Taiwan, for an evening session of League of Legends. The timing was deliberate. Riot Games was running a 400% bonus IP event, a promotional period in which players earned points toward in-game content at 4 times the normal rate. And serious players across Asia were logging marathon sessions to maximize their gains. Chen settled in for what the cafe's other customers assumed was a normal extended session. He had been treated for a pre-existing heart condition the previous September, a fact his family confirmed to police after the event. At some point during the night or the following morning, Chen died in his seat. His hands remained on the keyboard and mouse fingers extended toward the screen in the same position they had been in while he was playing. 30 other customers were present in the cafe throughout the period he was there. No one noticed anything wrong. It was not until the following evening, approximately 9 hours after Chen is estimated to have died, that a female cafe employee approached to check on him, found his body cold and rigid, and called emergency services. The cause of death was determined to be cardiac arrest, attributed by investigators to the combination of his pre-existing condition, prolonged physical immobility, fatigue, and the cold temperature maintained in the cafe. The detail that 30 people had shared a room with a man who had been dead for 9 hours without anyone noticing generated enormous media attention across Asia and internationally. It was cited repeatedly as evidence not just of Chen's personal tragedy, but of the degree to which the individual experience inside an internet cafe had become so self-enclosed that the people around him had stopped perceiving him as a person to check on. He was 23 years old. In the weeks after his death, Riot Games received criticism from some players and health advocates for the 400% IP events themselves, with critics arguing that extended bonus periods functionally incentivized exactly the kind of marathon sessions associated with the worst health outcomes. Riot never formally changed its event structure in direct response to Chen's death, though in subsequent years, the company shifted away from IP as a currency system, entirely eliminating the specific incentive structure that had kept Chen and dozens of other players at their keyboards through the night. Chuang Diablo III. On July 15, 2012, an 18-year-old gamer, known only by his surname, Chuang, booked a private room at an internet cafe in Tainan, Taiwan, and began a marathon session of Diablo III, Blizzard's newly released action role-playing game. Diablo III had launched in May of that year to an enormous global audience, setting records for the fastest-selling PC game at the time. The cafe's private rooms, unlike the open floor of most establishments, offered isolated spaces where individuals could play uninterrupted, without noise from other customers or staff monitoring their condition. Chuang played for approximately 40 hours without adequate rest or nutrition. On the morning of July 15th, a cafe attendant entered to check on the room and found Chuang slumped at the desk. The attendant roused him and Chuang stood up. He took a few steps toward the door, then collapsed. Emergency services were called immediately. He was transported to hospital and pronounced dead on arrival. Doctors attributed the cause to cardiac failure associated with severe exhaustion and lack of hydration, a conclusion consistent with the autopsy findings. He was the second gaming death in Taiwan that year, following Rong-yu's case in February, a fact noted prominently in subsequent coverage. Taiwanese authorities responded with increased police patrols of internet cafe premises and renewed public health warnings about prolonged gaming sessions, specifically addressing the risk to younger customers in private room configurations which offered less passive observation than open-plan cafe layouts. The private room design, which had become popular, partly for the comfort and quiet it offered, serious players had no mechanism for staff to passively observe a customer's condition the way an open floor did, and Chuang's case prompted several cafe chains to introduce check-in requirements for private room bookings above a certain duration. Reckful, World of Warcraft, and Twitch. On July 2nd, 2020, Byron Reckful Bernstein was found dead in his apartment in Austin, Texas. He was 31 years old. His death was confirmed as suicide by the Travis County Medical Examiner in October 2020. Bernstein had been one of the most influential figures in the early history of competitive gaming and live streaming simultaneously. In World of Warcraft, he had ranked first in arena combat for 6 consecutive seasons, become the first player in the game's history to reach a 3,000 rating in the arena system, and represented Comp Lexity Gaming in organized competition. He launched his Twitch channel in 2009 when the platform was still called Justin TVE and became one of its earliest high subscriber presences. At the time of his death, he had nearly 940,000 followers and had been one of the people who established the template for what a professional streaming career looked like. What Bernstein had also done, with a directness unusual for a figure of his profile at the time, was discuss his mental health in public. He had been diagnosed with bipolar II disorder as a child. He spoke on his streams about depression, about the way the gaming world's metrics of activity and engagement interacted with the crash periods that followed manic phases, about what it felt like to have hundreds of thousands of people watching for output during the periods when output was the last thing he could produce. He live streamed a therapy session with a psychiatrist in an attempt to publicly model what seeking help looked like. His older brother Guy had died by suicide when Byron was 6 years old, an event he returned to in interviews repeatedly as the formative experience that had shaped his understanding of mental illness from a very young age, something he described as having shaped his understanding of depression from a younger age than most people encounter it. In the weeks before July 2nd, Bernstein had been active on social media and had posted a marriage proposal to an ex-girlfriend on Twitter, which became the subject of public mockery. Hours before his death, he tweeted that he was aware his thinking had become disordered. The response from the gaming community after his death was one of the largest public mourning responses the esports world had produced. In World of Warcraft, players gathered by the hundreds in Stormwind Cathedral for an impromptu memorial. Twitch's statement explicitly named the stigma around mental health treatment as a contributing factor in his loss. In 2021, Blizzard announced the addition of a non-player character named Reckful to World of Warcraft, a memorial that placed him inside the game he had become famous playing. He was the first person to be honored in this way in the game's history. The psychiatrist Bernstein had live stream sessions with Dr. Alok Kanoja, subsequently became one of the most prominent voices in gaming mental health support, and founded a dedicated mental health organization for gamers and content creators, work he described as having been shaped by his experience with Bernstein and the community's response to his death. The 2024 investigation by the Massachusetts Medical Licensing Board into Dr. Kanojia's conduct in the context of his relationship with Bernstein, which resulted in a formal reprimand, added a complicated coda to the ways Bernstein's case had intersected with the professional mental health world during his final years. Lee Seung-hyun, StarCraft II match fixing. On August 28, 2016, South Korean StarCraft II professional Lee Seung-hyun, known by his game handle, Life, one of the most decorated players in the history of the game, was arrested by Korean authorities on suspicion of match fixing. Life was 19 years old at the time and had been considered by most analysts to be the best StarCraft II player in the world at his peak. He had won the global StarCraft II League at the age of 16, becoming the youngest player ever to claim a GSL title, and had accumulated career earnings and sponsorship arrangements that placed him among the highest earning competitive gamers of his era. The investigation revealed that Life had agreed to deliberately lose specific matches in exchange for payments totaling approximately 60 million Korean won, roughly $52,000 US, arranged through a Korean sports betting ring. In November 2016, he was convicted of violating Korean law against illegal sports gambling and received an 18-month suspended prison sentence, a fine, and a lifetime ban from participating in all Korean esports events. Life attempted to compete internationally to circumvent the domestic ban, but the Korean esports regulatory body KESPA coordinated with international tournament organizers to ensure the ban was recognized globally. His career was over at 19. In interviews given after the scandal, former teammates and coaches described Life as someone who had been placed under extreme performance pressure from a very young age, who had entered professional play at 14, and whose relationship with money and financial management had never been adequately supported by the organizational structures around him. None of these observations were offered as justifications, but they framed the conditions under which a teenager at the peak of his professional powers had concluded that $52,000 from a gambling ring was worth more than his career. The Life case produced significant changes in how Korean esports organizations approached player contracts, financial transparency, and anti-corruption monitoring. South Korea had already experienced a devastating match-fixing scandal in its professional StarCraft Brood War scene in 2010, in which more than a dozen players had been banned and several prosecuted. That Life had repeated the pattern in StarCraft, despite the 2010 scandal having publicly demonstrated the consequences, prompted a comprehensive review of the financial structure of Korean esports and the conditions under which very young players with significant earnings but limited financial education were vulnerable to outside approaches from gambling operations. Faker match-fixing allegations. Background and Kim Bus Sang-hyun. This entry requires context before the case. In 2015, South Korean League of Legends had established itself as the world's most prestigious competitive ecosystem, with the LCK attracting the sport's largest viewership and producing its dominant world champions. It was in this environment, on October 6, 2015, that Kim Sang-hyun, a mid-lane player in Korea's second-tier Challenger Series, under the handle Bus, was arrested and subsequently convicted of match-fixing in professional League of Legends, matches becoming one of the first players formally prosecuted under Korea's expanded esports integrity laws following the StarCraft scandals. Kim had accepted payments in exchange for deliberately underperforming in specific matches, and the investigation connected his case to a broader network of illegal sports gambling operators targeting challenger-level players who earned significantly less than LCK professionals, but operated within the same competitive ecosystem. Kim received a suspended sentence and a permanent ban from Korean esports. His case mattered beyond its immediate facts because it demonstrated that match fixing in Korean esports had not been contained to StarCraft, despite the high-profile prosecutions of 2010, and that it had migrated into League of Legends at the developmental tier where players were most financially vulnerable and least protected by team support structures. The Korea Esports Association, having already implemented reforms after 2010 that had clearly been insufficient, formally expanded its player conduct and financial integrity programs in direct response to the bust conviction requiring teams at all tiers to implement minimum standards for player contracts, salary payment, schedules, and reporting mechanisms for suspicious approaches from outside parties. The broader pattern the Bust and Life cases together illustrated was structural Korean esports, despite its global prestige and viewership figures, had created a two-tier economic reality in which the gap between LCK level earnings and challenger level earnings was large enough to make younger developmental players systematically vulnerable to the same corruption networks that had destroyed the first generation of Korean StarCraft professionals 6 years earlier. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for similar ones, and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video in the comments below. If any of these stories raise difficult feelings for you or someone you know, support is available. The 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline in the United States can be reached by calling or texting 988. International resources are available at findahelpline.com.